The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting cold shadows across the examination room. Staff Sergeant Dana Holt tapped her pen against the clipboard. "Shirt up for torso inspection." Isabella Marquez froze. Her fingers brushed the hem, then stopped, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Silence stretched. Holt's voice softened. "Whenever you're ready." With a deep breath, Isabella lifted the fabric. The room went silent the moment Isabella Marquez lifted her shirt. A jagged scar cut across her abdomen. Deliberate, brutal, impossible to ignore. Colonel Robert Hayes, a man who'd faced war zones without flinching, turned away, jaw tight. And then she spoke, voice steady as stone. "This isn't a wound. It's a promise." From that moment, none of us saw her the same way again. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their cold white glow casting long, sterile shadows across the linoleum floor. The air in the military examination room was sharp with the scent of disinfectant. The kind of clean that wasn't inviting, but institutional, almost judgmental. A single clock ticked against the far wall, its rhythm joining the distant echo of boots on concrete outside. Staff Sergeant Dana Holt stood at the far end of the room, clipboard in hand, eyes flicking over a column of names on the day's roster. She was the kind of medical NCO who had seen it all. 2 decades in uniform, countless recruits processed, and more medical histories than she could remember. Holt was calm, precise, and rarely surprised. In her mind, her role was as much about reading people as it was about reading their charts, and she prided herself on being able to handle both with the same professional detachment. The door opened quietly and Isabella Marquez stepped inside. She was 19, but there was nothing of the eager, restless energy Holt expected from recruits her age. Isabella's posture was straight, not stiff, her hands relaxed at her sides, her hair tied back neatly. Her clothes, a plain white t-shirt and fitted jeans, were clean and pressed. But her eyes told another story. They were dark, steady, and much too old for her face. There was no flicker of nervous excitement, no anxious darting to the clipboard or the uniform. Instead, there was a stillness, a quiet heaviness, as though she had carried something far heavier than a rucksack for far too long. Holt's instinct sharpened. She knew this look. She had seen it before in combat medics returning from the field, in soldiers who had stood too close to the edge of something horrific and lived to tell about it, or chosen not to. "Name?" Holt asked, pen poised. "Marquez, Isabella." The voice was calm, measured. Holt made a note and gestured toward the examination area. "Routine physical. Shirt up for torso inspection. You can keep your bra on." Isabella's eyes flickered, just for a second. Her fingers brushed the hem of her shirt, then stopped. The movement was so small that Holt might have missed it, but she'd learned long ago that hesitation always had a story. From behind, the door swung open again. Colonel Robert Hayes entered the room with the kind of presence that altered the air itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and a weathered face, Hayes carried himself like a man who had survived more than one battlefield. He had been in Iraq, Afghanistan, and more classified places than most soldiers knew existed. He'd pulled men from burning vehicles, directed fire under artillery barrages, and faced situations where hesitation meant death. And yet, the moment he stepped into the room, Isabella's hesitation deepened. "How are we doing, Sergeant Holt?" Hayes asked, voice carrying the steady authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Just beginning the torso inspection, sir." Holt glanced at Isabella again. "Whenever you're ready." Silence stretched. Isabella's gaze shifted between Holt and Hayes, and for an instant, something almost childlike flickered across her expression. Vulnerability, unshielded and raw. Then she inhaled deeply, as though bracing against a wave. Slowly, she lifted the fabric of her shirt. The room seemed to stop breathing. Across Isabella's abdomen, a jagged scar ran from just below her left rib cage to the crest of her right hip bone. It wasn't the straight, clean line of surgery or the uneven mark of an accident. This was different, deliberate, brutal, and surgical in its cruelty. The skin was raised and ridged, an angry rope of scar tissue that seemed almost to pulse under the fluorescent light. Holt's medical training cataloged details instantly: depth, healing pattern, the absence of proper medical closure. But the part of her that was simply human felt the weight of it, the unspoken violence behind such a wound. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the colonel shift. Hayes, the man who had faced incoming fire without flinching, took a half step back. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted away from the sight, and for a moment, the lines of command and composure faltered. "Dear God!" His voice was low, almost unwilling to be heard. Isabella held her shirt in place, her chin slightly lifted, her eyes fixed on a point beyond both of them. Her breathing was steady, deliberate, as though she had rehearsed this moment countless times. "This isn't a wound," she said, her voice carrying an iron steadiness that cut through the silence. "It's a promise." Holt felt the words as much as she heard them, and in that instant, she knew the examination had shifted into something else entirely. This wasn't about medical clearance anymore. This was about something deeper, a story carved into flesh, and the kind of resolve that could change the course of an entire mission. And from that moment, none of them, not Holt, not Hayes, not anyone in that room, would see Isabella Marquez the same way again. Before the scar, before the uniform, Isabella Marquez was just a girl from El Paso with dreams that seemed bigger than the desert sky. She lived in a small house with her mother, a seamstress who worked late into the night, and her younger brother Mateo, who had a smile that could disarm anyone. Her father had passed when she was 10, leaving behind only his old guitar and a stubborn streak that ran deep in Isabella's veins. She loved school, especially history, and spoke often about becoming a teacher. Her weekends were spent between helping her mother, tutoring Mateo, and taking the bus to visit her grandmother across the border in Ciudad Juarez. Life was simple, not easy, but it was hers. That changed when her grandmother's health began to fail. On the morning of her 17th birthday, Isabella boarded the bus alone for Juarez, carrying a small bag with gifts and her school books. It was a trip she had made countless times. Familiar streets, the hum of conversations in Spanish, the faint smell of roasted corn from roadside vendors. But that day, familiarity turned into nightmare. She was just 2 blocks from her grandmother's house when it happened. 3 men emerged from a rusted van, their movements precise, predatory. One grabbed her from behind, another pressed a cold, metallic object into her ribs. The third pulled a hood over her head. The world became muffled chaos. The smell of gasoline and sweat, the scrape of boots against metal, the suffocating heat inside the van. She tried to scream, but a rough hand covered her mouth. When the hood was finally pulled off, she was no longer in the city. The dim, stifling air of a windowless warehouse wrapped around her. The walls reeked of damp concrete and old blood. The floor was littered with makeshift bedding, water-stained cardboard, and shadows that shifted as other girls turned to look. Some were barely teenagers. Others were in their early 20s. Their eyes held the same fear she felt in her bones. The days blurred into one another. There was no clock, no sunlight, only the buzz of a single light bulb and the constant sound of footsteps outside the locked door. They were fed just enough to keep them alive. Some girls whispered about the cartel, others spoke of El Sombra, the shadow, a man whose name alone made them flinch. Isabella survived by watching, listening, learning. She memorized guard routines, learned who could be bribed with small favors, and whispered hope to the youngest girls when the nights grew too heavy. She refused to let her mind go numb, clinging to small rituals, reciting the capitals of every country she knew, picturing her brother's smile, anything to keep her humanity intact. Her first escape attempt came after 2 months. She had slipped out through a loose ventilation grate, crawling until her knees bled. But a locked outer gate stopped her. They found her minutes later. The punishment for the 3rd attempt was the scar. She was dragged into a separate room, cold concrete walls, a single chair bolted to the floor. The man called El Sombra stood over her. His voice was calm, almost polite, as he explained that he would leave her alive, but he would make sure she never forgot who she belonged to. The blade wasn't sharp like a surgeon's scalpel. It was a machete, deliberate and heavy, each movement calculated. He knew exactly where to cut to avoid killing her, carving from left rib to right hip with brutal precision. The pain was blinding, white-hot, drowning out the world until she collapsed against the restraints. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. "Every time you see it," he whispered, "you'll remember you are ours." She didn't scream, not once. After that, she could barely walk. The wound festered in the weeks that followed, and no real medical care came. Only rags and dirty water. But she refused to die there. She cleaned it as best she could, using scraps of cloth and stolen antiseptic from the guard's supplies. Her body healed crooked, the scar rising like rope beneath her skin. The rescue came 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days after the abduction. The first sign was the distant thump of rotor blades, then shouts in Spanish and English. The door burst open in a rain of splinters, and armed men in tactical gear flooded the room. The insignia on their uniforms, a mix of Mexican, federal police, and FBI, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She was pulled to her feet by a female agent who shouted over the chaos, "You're safe now." But Isabella knew safety was a fragile word. The journey back was a blur. The sterile light of a hospital in El Paso, the steady beep of monitors, the slow, grinding work of rehabilitation. Her body recovered faster than her mind. Nights were the worst. The dark brought back the smell of that warehouse, the sound of boots outside a locked door. Therapy was grueling. At first, she resisted, unwilling to let strangers dig into her memories. But one therapist, a former crisis counselor, told her something that shifted everything. What happened to you does not define you. What you do next will. So Isabella rebuilt herself. She studied languages, Spanish, English, and even a third, learning bits of Russian to understand the cartel's foreign connections. She trained in crisis response, volunteered with Border Patrol medical units, and earned her GED. But the scar never faded. She stopped hiding it. It was no longer a mark of ownership. It was proof. Proof that she had survived the worst a man could do to her and had come back standing. And deep down, she knew it was also something else. A promise. A promise that she would go back into the shadows one day, not as a victim, but as the hunter. It was 6 months after the rescue when Agent Lauren Pierce walked into Isabella's rehabilitation room. She was tall, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and carried the kind of quiet authority that came from years of chasing the worst people on earth. Pierce didn't waste time on small talk. She set a thin case file on the table between them, the FBI seal catching the afternoon light. "We've been tracking the network that held you," she said, her voice even. "What you saw, what you survived, that was just one warehouse, one tentacle. This thing stretches across borders, into dozens of cities. We believe there are hundreds of victims right now as we speak." Isabella's gaze dropped to the file. Inside were photographs, aerial images of compounds, grainy shots of guarded gates, lists of missing women. She recognized some faces. Pierce leaned forward. "We need people who understand them from the inside. Their patterns, their discipline, their mistakes. You could help us bring them down." The words settled deep inside Isabella. She realized that her scar wasn't just a reminder. It was leverage, an insight no training manual could teach. She agreed, but on one condition. "If I'm going to do this, I want military training first, full operational capability. I won't just consult, I'll stand in the field." The next 2 years were a transformation. Isabella threw herself into language training, perfecting Spanish and English, learning Portuguese to follow South American trafficking routes, and even picking up Russian phrases tied to Eastern European crime syndicates. She earned certifications in crisis counseling, studying how to stabilize victims in the first critical hours after rescue. She learned to work alongside law enforcement, sitting in on FBI briefings, observing DEA operations, and shadowing Homeland Security agents. Her instructors noted her ability to absorb detail, to connect patterns others missed. But what set her apart wasn't just skill, it was purpose. Every drill, every long night of study, every bruise from combatives training carried the same quiet mantra. For the ones still inside. When Isabella's enlistment application reached Staff Sergeant Dana Holt's desk, Holt was skeptical. The official recommendation from Agent Pierce was strong, but Holt had seen trauma derail even the most determined recruits. She brought her concerns to Colonel Robert Hayes, and they requested input from Dr. Evelyn Carr, the base's chief psychologist. The three met in Hayes's office, blinds drawn against the glare of the afternoon sun. "She's high risk," Holt began. "PTSD, survivor's guilt, Potential triggers in combat situations. We put her in a high-stress environment. She could freeze. Dr. Carr shook her head. You're assuming she reacts like a typical trauma survivor. She doesn't. In clinical evaluations, she shows exceptional emotional regulation. The FBI has been trying to recruit her for 2 years for that exact reason. Hayes listened, fingers steepled. So you're saying she's an asset? I'm saying, Carr replied, that she's already operating at a level most soldiers never reach. She's functioned in hostile environments without support. She can handle herself. Holt crossed her arms. And if she can't, then we deal with it, Hayes said flatly. But we don't ignore what she brings to the table. The decision might have dragged on for weeks if not for the incident on the parade grounds. It was a humid afternoon when a young recruit collapsed during formation, heat exhaustion dropping him to the asphalt. By the time Holt reached the scene, Isabella was already there. She knelt beside the recruit, her movements efficient and calm. You, get me water. You, shade him with your jacket. And you, run to medical, now. There was no hesitation, no wasted words. Within minutes, the recruit's breathing steadied. When the medics arrived, Isabella stepped back without ceremony, letting them take over. Holt noticed something in that moment, the way other recruits looked at Isabella. Not like a peer, but like someone they trusted to make the right call under pressure. Later that day, Holt found herself in Hayes' office again. She took control like she'd been doing it for years, Holt admitted. Didn't panic, didn't wait for permission. Hayes gave a small, knowing nod. That's what I've been telling you. She saves people. Doctor, Carr added quietly, the question isn't whether she's fit for military service. It's whether military service is ready for her. Hayes turned to Holt. Bring her in. I want to hear her plan. For Isabella Marquez, the decision had already been made the day she was cut open and left alive. She had spent years preparing for this moment. Now the uniform wasn't just clothing, it was a weapon, and she intended to use it. The operations room buzzed with a low, controlled energy. Maps and satellite images covered the walls, red markers indicating guard positions, escape tunnels, and choke points. The air smelled faintly of coffee and metal, the scent of long nights and ready weapons. At the head of the table, Colonel Robert Hayes stood with his hands braced on the edge, addressing a room of elite operators, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force, and a handful of FBI tactical specialists. In the center of the table sat the mission file, Honduras, target, El Sombra's primary processing facility. This is the largest confirmed trafficking hub in the region, Hayes said, voice clipped. 43 confirmed captives, 12 of them American citizens. The compound is heavily fortified. 60 armed guards, early warning systems, and escape routes leading into the jungle. Traditional law enforcement has failed. We will not. A ranger captain tapped the map. Intel this detailed is rare. What makes us so certain? From the back of the room, Isabella Marquez stepped forward. Because I've been inside places like it, she said evenly. The room shifted. Operators who had been half bent over their notes now looked up, studying her. Isabella stopped beside the projection of the compound's floor plan, her hands steady as she pointed to a section on the east wing. They'll keep the captives here. Windows barred from the inside, locks designed to delay escape but quick to open if they need to move them. Guards rotate every 4 hours, but the kitchen staff is constant. That's your weak point. If we take them out quietly, we can control access without raising an alarm. A SEAL lieutenant narrowed his eyes. And how do you know they'll react the way you're describing? Isabella didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled at the hem of her tactical shirt and lifted it to just below her ribs. The scar caught the harsh light, every ridge and jagged curve visible in sharp detail. They'll react exactly the way I say, she told them, voice steady. Because the man who runs that compound is the one who gave me this. No one spoke. Even the seasoned operators, men who had seen war up close, stared at the scar, then back at her face. What they saw there wasn't just survival. It was a vow. Hayes broke the silence. We lift off at 0400. You have 6 hours to finalize prep. The hangar was alive with movement in the pre-dawn darkness. Crates were being loaded, weapons checked and rechecked, comms tested in short, sharp bursts. The thrum of idling rotors echoed against the metal walls, vibrating in the chest. Isabella moved through the organized chaos with quiet focus. She double-checked her gear, sidearms secured, headset fitted, extra restraints packed for the captives they'd rescue. She had done missions before, but this one was different. In a corner away from the noise, she paused to adjust the photograph taped inside her vest pocket. Mateo, her younger brother, grinning in the Texas sunlight. She touched the edge of the photo, then her scar, grounding herself in the Y. Hayes approached, helmet under his arm. "You ready?" Isabella gave a short nod. "I've been ready for years." Inside the helicopter, red cabin lights bathed the team in an otherworldly glow. The seats were lined with gear-laden operators, each lost in their own thoughts. Some checked weapons. Others simply stared into the darkness beyond the open hatch. Isabella sat near the front, headset on, the steady thump of the rotors filling her ears. She glanced across at a SEAL who had challenged her intel earlier. He caught her gaze, gave a short nod. Not of apology, but of acknowledgement. She returned it. As the engines roared to full power, Hayes' voice came over comms. "Remember the mission. We are in and out. Lives depend on speed and silence." The helicopter lifted from the tarmac, the city lights of San Antonio shrinking below them. The horizon ahead was nothing but darkness, broken only by the faint glow of stars and the promise of what waited in Honduras. Isabella rested her gloved hand lightly over her abdomen. The scar was there, but it no longer burned. It anchored her. Each vibration of the aircraft felt like a drumbeat, pushing her closer to the place where the past and present would collide. Tonight, the hunter was flying straight into the heart of the shadows. The helicopters skimmed low over the jungle canopy, their rotors muffled by suppression systems. The horizon ahead was still dark, the first hints of dawn just a pale line in the east. Inside the cabin, the operators moved with silent precision, eyes locked on their gear, minds already inside the target. Through her headset, Isabella Marquez listened as Colonel Hayes ran through the final confirmation. "Team Alpha, you take the north wall. Bravo, with me on the south. Marquez, you're coordinating entry timing for both teams. Once inside, control comms and direct extractions." She acknowledged, her voice steady. "Copy. All units, sync on my mark. We breach at 0300. The compound emerged from the tree line like a jagged stone. Corrugated metal walls, guard towers at each corner, floodlights sweeping the perimeter. Just as Isabella had predicted, the eastern side showed weaker guard rotation. Alpha team ghosted into position, silencers ready. At her signal, 2 suppressed shots took down the nearest sentries. Hayes' Bravo team mirrored the move on their side. The teams breached simultaneously, bolt cutters on chain links, charges on reinforced doors. Inside the walls, the teams split into their assigned routes. Alpha moved toward the holding quarters, Bravo to the guard barracks. Isabella stayed near the comms hub, headset linked to every squad leader, eyes darting between the live feed from drones and the floor plan spread in front of her. A sudden burst of static in her earpiece. "Alpha 2, contact! 2 hostiles moving toward Block C." Isabella reacted instantly. "Bravo 3, cut through maintenance tunnel and flank them from the west. Alpha 2, hold your position. Stay low." Seconds later, 2 muffled bursts confirmed her orders had worked. Hostiles down, no friendly casualties. Hayes' voice came through, low but edged with approval. "Good call, Marquez. Keep it tight." She hadn't planned to see him this soon, but fate, as always, was unpredictable in the field. While moving to secure the comms hub's inner corridor, Isabella rounded a corner, and there he was. Miguel El Sombra Rojas. Taller than she remembered, dressed in civilian clothes but with the same cold eyes that had leaned over her in that concrete room years ago. His right hand hovered near the pistol at his waistband, but it froze the moment he recognized her. For a fraction of a second, neither moved. The sounds of the raid, distant gunfire, shouts, boots, seemed to fade. "Marquez!" His voice was almost amused, like he'd found a ghost in his hallway. "So they finally sent you back to me." She kept her weapon trained on him, her stance rock solid. "No," she said, her voice as steady as steel. "I came for you." His smirk faltered when she stepped closer. Hands where I can see them. Instead of complying, he tilted his head. You think you can kill me and it changes what happened. You'll always... Her finger tightened on the trigger. I'm not here to kill you. I'm here to end you. Bravo 2 appeared at her flank, weapons up. In seconds, El Sombra was on the ground, wrists zip-tied, weapon kicked away. The reversal was complete. The man who had tried to brand her as property was now just another prisoner under her control. With El Sombra secured, Isabella moved with Bravo toward the east wing. The air was heavy with the stench of sweat and fear. Inside the locked quarters, huddled in the dim light, were the captives, thin, exhausted, but alive. She holstered her weapon and spoke in calm Spanish. Soy Isabella. Estamos aquí para llevarlos a casa. I'm Isabella. We're here to take you home. The relief in their eyes was instant. Operators moved quickly, escorting them out in pairs, providing water and blankets. Isabella stayed until the last person was clear, her gaze scanning every corner for stragglers. Over comms. All teams, extraction in 2 minutes. We are green across the board. Back at the landing zone, the rescued were loaded into medevac helicopters. Hayes stood off to the side, watching as Isabella supervised the final boarding. When the last door shut, he approached her. You did more than anyone could have asked, he said quietly. She looked toward the tree line where the compound still stood, its floodlights now extinguished, the perimeter swarming with Allied forces. This was one. There are more. Hayes gave a single nod. Then we'll keep going. As the helicopters lifted, Isabella settled into her seat, helmet in her lap. She felt the weight of exhaustion in her limbs, but also something else, a sharp, unshakable clarity. The girl who had once been dragged into the shadows was gone. What remained was a soldier, a strategist, and a hunter who had just claimed her first victory in a war she had no intention of losing. Her scar no longer ached. It burned now with purpose. The base was quieter now, the chaos of the mission replaced by the low hum of generators and the occasional clang of equipment being stowed. Isabella Marquez sat alone on a bench outside the operations building, the night air cool against her skin. Above her, the stars stretched endless and sharp, reminding her of the nights she once stared at through the barred window of a warehouse. She traced her fingers lightly over her abdomen, feeling the raised ridges of the scar beneath the fabric. It had been years since the day Miguel El Sombra Rojas carved it into her. Years of hospitals, training grounds, and missions that took her into the darkest corners of the world. She had survived all of it, and more importantly, she had made it mean something. From across the yard, Colonel Robert Hayes approached. Months ago, in that stark examination room, he had turned away from that same scar, unsettled by its brutality. Back then, he'd seen only the risk, the fragility that trauma could bring. Now, after watching her in Honduras coordinate 2 teams under fire, adapt to shifting threats, and guide dozens of captives to safety, his view had changed completely. You did more than I expected, he said quietly, stopping beside her. Isabella looked up at him, her expression calm. I told you, I'm not here just to survive. Hayes studied her for a moment, the weight of his years in service visible in his eyes. That scar, it's not a wound anymore. It's a standard, a reminder to the rest of us of what determination looks like. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the distant sound of a helicopter shutting down. Later in her quarters, Isabella unzipped her jacket and stood before the mirror. She pulled her shirt aside, letting the dim light trace over the jagged line. It no longer carried the shadow of the man who gave it to her. Now it carried the faces of those she'd saved, in Honduras and beyond, and the promise to return for those still waiting. She thought of Mateo back in El Paso, her mother, the girls in that warehouse, and the ones she'd met on missions since. Each life she touched was another reason to keep going, another reason to wear the uniform not just as a soldier, but as a protector. The scar was no longer about pain. It was about purpose. When Isabella stepped away from the mirror, she was already thinking about the next mission. Somewhere, another door was locked. Another voice was whispering false promises in the dark. And she intended to be the one to break that door down. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the shadow's worst enemy. And she wasn't done. In America today, Isabella's story isn't just about a soldier or a scar. It's about the resilience that lives inside every one of us. Many of us carry scars, though not all can be seen. Some come from war, some from loss, and some from life itself. But like Isabella, we have the choice to let them define us or to turn them into a source of purpose. Her journey reminds us that justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because ordinary people decide to step forward, to protect, to serve, to refuse to look away. In a country still facing the harsh reality of human trafficking, domestic abuse, and countless other injustices, her mission is a challenge to us all. What will we do when we see the shadows? For some, the scar might be a warning of what evil can do. For others, it's a rallying cry that says, I survived and I will fight. Which do you see? That's where I'd like to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe resilience can be taught, or is it born from struggle? Thank you for walking through this story with me. If it moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people can hear stories like Isabella's. The more we speak of them, the more we remind each other, the light is always stronger than the dark.